Good day to you. This is being recorded on April 4th. Um, I think you probably fall into two categories. Those of you who can't stand thinking about the Ukraine anymore and are trying their best to tune out, and those of you who are junkies and who are listening and watching programs around the clock. And I suppose there might be a small in-between group amongst them. But so much is going on, and Ukraine is increasingly so important in world affairs that it's worth continuing to talk about it. One of the things I think is worth saying is that one can't isolate the Ukraine-Russian situation as being, a particular set of events that doesn't affect most people in the world. Because by now it's become clear that the spin-offs of the Ukraine situation have worldwide implications. There are very few countries in the world, of the almost 200 countries, that are not touched directly or indirectly by the whole mess with respect to Ukraine. And some folks may not have felt the effects yet, but will affect them very soon. So those folks, I think it probably includes Friedman, New York Times, but also others who are saying, actually, we're having a sort of world war, or at least we're having a conflict which has global implications. It's not a regional, it's not between some countries. It's not even between the Ukraine and Europe and Russia and the United States. It's everywhere, and everybody is affected by it. Now, the most obvious thing to say about Ukraine is that the situation right now is in limbo and very messy. Yes, the Russians have sort of pulled out of the towns surrounding Kiev and are saying they're regrouping in the east. But you've also noticed, probably for those of you who watch it on TV, bodies lying all over the place, war crimes committed on their way out, Russians shooting local residents, binding their arms against their back, shooting them in the head, and so forth. So we're in a phase of serious war crimes being committed by the Russian military. And how do we know they're war crimes? Well, because there's all kinds of international law and all kinds of courts, as I've mentioned before, that were set up post-World War II so that one wouldn't have the repeats of the genocide and the various war crimes that came about in the 20th century. So there's a lot of international law. I don't want to bore you with it, but when it is said, even on stations like CNN, that the Russians are being charged with committing war crimes, that's not just idle rhetoric. That is, in fact, situations have occurred and are occurring, which by any international standard in the 21st century are war crimes. Okay. Now, by the time you listen to this, maybe things have already changed in Ukraine, but supposedly the Russians are now amassing on the eastern provinces that they want to capture. But as you know, Mariupol, the city, has been flattened. It's something on the order of what they did in Aleppo, what they did in Chechnya, what happened in World War II, and Dresden, which was had no particular relevance for war action, was pretty much leveled, and that was discussed as a war crime in World War II, quite aside from genocide and the other things. But so the Russians seem to be moving in the direction of wanting to conquer the East and expand even the provinces that they have been running. Mariupol is completely flattened. By any standard, that's a war crime. But here's the larger issue. The larger issue is, I think, that the Russians not only want the East, but they want the port cities on the Black Sea, Mariupol being one of them, and now they're beginning to attack Odessa. If they would conquer all of these cities that are used for shipping in the Black Sea, what they've effectively will have done is make Ukraine not only a whole lot smaller, but make it into a landlocked country. And we've already discussed the fact that Ukraine is one of the breadbaskets of the world. Many countries are dependent on Ukrainian grain, for example, or grains in the plural. And if in the future, once this conflict with Russia is over, Ukraine is in no position to ship out the grain with ships through the Black Sea, you've not only, in a sense, reduced the size of the Ukraine and ceased giving it access to the Black Sea, which historically has been important, but you will effectively diminish the capacity of the Ukrainian economy to resurrect itself. So we're not just talking about, some idle territories in the Ukraine that the Russians would want. What they essentially want to do is not only expand their Russian empires, that is what Putin has in mind again, but they also want to create a situation where the Ukraine of the last decade or two is no more. And the question is, how can Ukraine manage without access to the Black Sea? So we're talking about very serious issues here. And we're also talking about the fact that the Russian military seems not to have done very well in its attempt to, capture Kiev and other things, and that they have withdrawn. But it's noteworthy now to say that in order to do what the Russians want to do in the east and along the coast of the Black Sea, will be augmented by militaries who have a lot more capacity. You might have noticed that the call has gone out from Russia to something called the Wagner Group. We've already talked about that in the past. They're mercenaries, and they're mercenaries, by the way, who are all over Africa, especially West Africa. We'll talk about that again some other time. But they've also asked for, war-hardened soldiers from the Syrian conflict, and to some extent, even people going back to the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. Now, the Russians, of course, will say, well, why shouldn't we bring in people from around the world? After all, the Ukrainian government also has, I think, 200,000 or so volunteers from England and the United States and elsewhere. But we're really talking a magnitude that is quite different on the case of the Russian side. So what does that amount to? What it amounts to is that the Russians are not down and out, that they're not about to retreat, that most observers think this is going to go on for a long time at a huge cost to Ukrainian civilians, maybe at a large cost to the military on the Russian side, but they don't much care, right, if the recruits are cannon fodder. In fact, in some of the towns surrounding Kiev, they left the bodies of the Russian soldiers right where they were, and not just the local people. So is this a change? No, it's a slight switch. It's an escalation, and it's an escalation of what the military is intending to do. But there are additional issues, and that is, I think most observers think that the Russians will escalate a bit above and beyond the military on the ground and the missiles that they're currently using in their campaigns. Generally speaking, the most likely expansion is into cyber, and the attack of the Russians, cyber attacks throughout Europe, banks in Europe, energy producing stations in Europe. So it's not just enough to say, okay, well, we will continue to buy Russian oil if you're Europe. But the minute you say, I think we're going to try not to do that anymore, there may be cyber attacks to the energy installations of different kinds in different countries. That is to say, bring Europeans to their knees in the sense that while it's still pretty cold in Europe, there's no heating, there might not be electricity, or electricity might be interfered with. So cyber attacks are pretty much what is expected to be the next part of the next round in the Ukraine. There is, of course, still the specter of biological and chemical attacks. I don't think they can be ruled out, although I'm not so sure that that's the first thing that the Russians will do. I think cyber, I could be wrong, but cyber might be the next round. And then, of course, the third leg of this is possibly nuclear, and I think that's the least possible at the moment. So what I imagine to be is that Putin is obviously not backing off, and that there will be an escalation on the ground, military and in the air, but I think they will escalate to some cyber attacks in various Western European, Eastern European countries, maybe in the United States. Some countries are better prepared to fight off cyber, a picture not only of continuity, but possible escalation. Now, let me switch discussion slightly and say, these various sanctions were supposed to bring, Russia to the table. They are at the table in Ukraine, but nobody thinks those are serious negotiations at the moment. But it looked for a while like there was a fair amount of opposition in Russia. In fact, the polls now indicate that 80-something% of the Russians now support their government, that a few 100,000 Russians have left to Turkey and elsewhere, on the whole, educated tech people, journalists, and so on. But the opposition within Russia has decreased. And insofar as there still is opposition, people, of course, fear decades in prison, and so that has reduced opposition. So actually, Putin is better off right now in terms of public relations with his fellow Russians than he was 2 weeks ago. On the side of the West, including the United States, this is also difficult. There have been polls as to, do you support the United States in the Ukraine, or do you support the Russians? And there's overwhelming support in the United States for supporting Ukraine and American policy amongst people who are 65 and older. On the other hand, of younger population, 18 to 29, only 50% of those people are supporting Ukraine and the US government policy. The rest say favorable things about Russia. So how does one explain that? And there are echoes of that in various European countries, where, even in Western European countries, where the population is split between those who support Russia and those who support Ukraine. It's very odd, right? It sounds very odd. But I think one of the things we as Americans don't factor in is that a lot of it is anti-Americanism. It's less, to some extent, pro-Russia and more anti-American. We delude ourselves if we imagine that people in various Western European countries and Latin America, Africa, and so forth are all disposed to go along with the United States. And Russia has made considerable inroads in Africa, in the Middle East, even in Latin America. And so when you ask populations as to whose side they are on, and given the amount of anti-Americanism that has evolved over the past few decades, you can see that people automatically don't support us, quote unquote, the US and the Ukrainians. So if we think that this is the policies of the West, led by the United States, are particularly popular around the world, they really are not. in many parts of the world. And that's a sobering thought. And that actually would lead to us considering more broad-gauged foreign policies in various countries, and to see to what extent the anti-Americanism that has evolved through, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, the pullout of Afghanistan, our refugee policies, and so forth. I can make a long list. So we need not to delude ourselves. What we're doing is not all of that popular around the world. And that's before we even get to some of the topics that I discussed the last time, which has to do with energy and food. Many countries, from Egypt, I've talked about this the last time, to other countries, are very dependent for their grains from Ukraine-Russian, breadbasket. Even not just grains, but even things like sunflower oil and fertilizer comes from that part of the world, Ukraine, Russia. Those are necessary on the one hand to cook, and on the other hand to grow things. So the world food shortage, because of the war and because of Afghanistan and because of Yemen and because of other places, is increasingly declining. And so we are moving, as I said last time, into a situation where we have genuine famine in many countries. They simply don't have enough foodstuffs coming in. Now, partly this also has to do with transportation, but it also has to do with the interference of all the exports and grains which come from Ukraine, and what proportion of that is made up or can be made up by anyone else. You might have heard the director of the UN World Food Program pleading with the fact that you will have not just undernourished children, but children who starve to death in something on the order of 38 countries in the world, either now or within the next few weeks. That's a lot. That is a lot. And so while we are fixated visually on the Ukraine war, the spin-offs on the Ukraine war having to do with food, growing food, being able to import food, and being dependent on imports of food is probably one of the biggest looming disasters of decades now, and needs to be addressed, and not just the conflict on the ground. In addition, this food shortage situation coincides or overlaps with climate change, right? Which is producing large areas of the world which can no longer grow the food and the sustenance that that population needed, right? So in some ways, you have a perfect storm. You have a war which is interfering with food. You have a war which is interfering with energy sources, which you might need in some senses also to help produce food and to ship it and to manage it. You have a climate change, which in and of itself is a storm that has descended on quite a few countries. And the upshot of it all is, or upshots in the plural, are two. On the one hand, it leads to blaming the countries that are doing this to you. And on the other hand, it also generates large numbers of people who can no longer live where they're living. The general estimates are that something like 150 million people will not be able to live wherever they're living because the climate change, as well as now other interventions in food production, make it desirable or necessary for them to leave. And of course, the movement of people has been a big problem in any event. You now, we in the United States see more and more people from Latin America and from the Caribbean trying to get in the US. It's not because they have nothing better to do. People simply can't make a living anymore, and they're starving, and or they can't feed their families, and they want to try to figure out somewhere to go to make life viable for them. We get a lot from the Western Hemisphere. Europe gets a lot from North Africa, Middle East, and increasingly Africa. So while on the one hand, the movement of people away from where they're come from because they can't make a living, they can't survive, has been an independent factor in world affairs. That factor is now overlapping with the war and the spin-offs of war having to do with the Ukraine. You just a stray comment. You might have noticed that many European countries, or some European countries, are very hospitable. For example, Poland and the former East countries in allowing refugees in. Right? They've allowed about 4 million refugees in, but there are 10 million more internal refugees total in the Ukraine. So that's 6 on top of the 4 that have already left. And you've got a situation where the world is focused on, allowing these people to survive. But at the end of the day, where will they all go? Where will they all live? Can they possibly go back to the Ukraine? Well, certainly not to Mariupol. So where exactly do all these people go? And while the Eastern European countries have been very generous, the West European countries aren't necessary. I mean, the English are sending huge obstacles up about getting visas there. And the US, even though Biden said that, we would allow 100,000 asylum seekers into the US, people are, sort of clever. And part of what's happened, as you may have noticed in the news, is that middle-class people in the Ukraine who can get themselves out of there are going to Mexico, where it's not that difficult to get a visa to go to Mexico, and then come to the US border to try to seek asylum in the United States. So we're having a Ukrainian border issue, quite aside from the normal border issue. So, how many millions of people can be moving around the world? Well, we really don't know the answer to that, because climate change and what it will do down the road is as yet unclear if it can be slowed down. But we certainly now have a situation where the combination of climate change and the war in Ukraine and the political turmoil that both are creating in various countries are creating what I would say is an escalation, and why what is currently happening is no longer a kind of a regional war with Russia and Ukraine. It has become a world event. There are hardly any countries in the world which will not be touched by the combination of what is happening in Ukraine and possibly beyond Ukraine, and what's happening in the global food supply, and what is happening in terms of climate change. All those 3 overlap. And I think we better keep an eye on all of those 3, because how a big country like the United States, and for that matter, China and India, dispose themselves to these events is not at all clear. I think we underrate the trouble we're in and the trouble the world is in by, getting fixated on the bombardments in the Ukraine, which deserve a lot of attention. But what's not deserving enough of attention, it seems to me, that we are in the middle of a world conflict of the type that we've never seen before because of technology in part. People can immediately see what's happening, they can communicate, and it's not just cyber warfare in the sense of war, but cyber and all its implications are creating an overlap of world crises, something that the world has never seen before, and we have no real clue of managing. I try to be upbeat about some things, But I want to, in this particular talk, tell you that the world has never seen anything like this. And obviously, the statesmanship in Ukraine is very high. The negative statesmanship of Putin is dug in. The United States is pursuing reasonable policies, but we need to get a lot more creative than we have been, both in terms of our own situation as well as the movement of people of one kind or another. Now, by one kind or another, I want to finally say that it's one thing for East Europeans to welcome what seemingly are fairly similar people from a neighboring country. It is quite another thing when you begin to see big movements coming from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and when the racism kicks in, we don't want those people. In the UK, it's interesting because those people include people from East Europe who came in large numbers at the end of the Cold War to work as blue-collar workers, farm hands, and so forth. They were very unpopular in England because, they were changing our culture. So on the one hand, you have, the multicultural countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, and so forth, who are used to immigration, but are not sure of how much more immigration they want, especially with a population that is increasingly hostile to people who are different and look different than themselves. And then you have large parts of the world which are not used to large numbers of people having to leave, very often people with skills. And on the other hand, creating situations where the societies are not in a very good position to try to figure out ways how to feed their own populations at a higher level than they currently are doing. I know I sound sort of repetitive and boring here, but I can't say enough about how the war, climate change, transportation, and the possibilities of using cyber and chemical. In a sense, Pandora's box has been opened by Putin in this. Clear now that containment is not possible, and we're dealing in a new chapter in world affairs. Thank you very much for listening. We'll continue this in 2 weeks.